The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, C-Stores as Critical Infrastructure, Cyber Resilience in a Multi-Vendor Environment. We'd like to thank our presenters, Ashwin, Swamy, and Greg DeClue, and thank everybody for being here. Next slide. I am your host today, Allie Russell. Also, your last-minute moderator is the wonderful Cara Gunderson, who is the chair of our Data Security Committee and the director of Payment Card Operations at Citgo. Got called off to her regular day job, so you'll have to listen to me a little bit more than usual. Next slide. The agenda for today, we're going to go through some housekeeping, tell you a little bit about Conexxus, introduce you to the presenters, give you the presentation, and leave some time for some questions and answers. Next slide. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on Conexxus365.org. We ask that the participants ask your questions via the webinar interface and no vendor-specific questions. Our webinars may be used toward PCI continuing education credits, and if you're interested in that, please contact 365@conexxus.org. And if you're interested in speaking or sponsoring a Conexxus 365 event, contact 365@conexxus.org to discuss upcoming opportunities with our team. Next slide. Conexxus does not endorse any products or services that may be described or mentioned in this presentation, and the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the speakers and not of Conexxus. By hosting the webinar, Conexxus is not providing any legal advice. If you have any questions about legal issues raised or discussed, you should seek the assistance of attorneys who are competent in that area. Next slide. We would like to thank our 2021 Diamond sponsors. They are a great part of how we are able to put on such great content and make things like this happen. Next slide. A little bit about Conexxus. We are an independent, nonprofit, member-driven technology organization. We depend a lot on our volunteers, such as Ash, Greg, and Cara, to help us give you some really great content. We set standards in data exchange, security, and mobile commerce, and provide vision to identify emerging technologies and trends. And we advocate for our industry, believing that technology is policy. And if you would like to get to know anything more about Conexxus, you can email us at info@conexxus.org or visit our website. Next slide. This is our upcoming Conexxus 365 schedule. In March, we will have 2 free webinars, one on the True Age NACS verification initiative presented by Conexxus's Gray Taylor. And in March 11th, we will have an autopsy of the SolarWinds attack and modern malware weaponization by Danny Harris from Security Innovation. And if you're interested in more of our webinars, you can go to conexxus365.org to see more of our content, such as the new directions for customer loyalty that will be presented in April. Next slide. Please connect with Conexxus. You can do so either through Conexxus 365, as I mentioned, the Conexxus365.org, or just visit us at our website at conexxus.org. And please follow us on LinkedIn. We share a lot of really great industry-specific articles, and it's a great place to chat about the industry. Next slide.
Great. Well, I guess I'll jump in, Allie. Thanks, everyone, for joining the call, and thanks, Allie, for hosting today. So today, we'll be discussing the role that the convenience retail environment plays as critical infrastructure, and what really that means in terms of how adversarial state actors might view our industry from an attack standpoint, and then specific challenges we need to face in order to be prepared for today's threat landscape. I'm sure folks on this call are aware, with Conexxus, we often discuss the notion of the fourth industrial revolution really being about cyber physical systems, which simply refers to that interface between the digital and the physical worlds. Just in the last year, some of the notable cyber attacks have really made clear the type of threats we're going to see and the extent to which adversarial state actors will go to compromise our critical systems. And so I do want to give some context here before we really dive into specific applications in our industry. Some of you may have heard about the water treatment facility, I think it was just a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, that was recently breached in Oldsmar, Florida. For some background, the hacker briefly increase the amount of lye that was entering the water supply simply by leveraging insecurely configured remote access via TeamViewer. Now, the FBI is investigating this incident today, and it may have been the result of an insider threat, but there are some interesting applications to our retail environment, namely that you had a set of remotely managed systems, often with older operating systems, that are underpinning critical physical processes. In our case, it could be things happening at the dispenser or other processes happening inside the store. One moment. Now, I'm sure many of you are aware of the breach of SolarWinds Orion. Conexxus, as Ali mentioned, is doing a presentation on that next month. But there are some immediate takeaways we should consider about the SolarWinds incident as we think about the C-store environment. Now, first, the software supply chain poses a risk. And the interesting issue with that is that threats can often come from sources that should be otherwise trusted, whether it's a remote access vendor being breached or a firewall vendor being breached or any other vendor being breached that is typically supposed to be approved. So that's really one initial takeaway that we should keep in mind. The second is that breaches can and often do go unnoticed for extended periods of time, buying hackers plenty of time to compromise a wide range of networks and systems. And so we have to realize that we're always operating in an environment of unknown unknowns. And lastly, thinking about the fallout from the SolarWinds compromise and what happened in terms of the hackers' access to the FireEye tools, we need to be able to respond quickly and effectively and at scale, meaning whether you're a solar operator on this call or whether you have 100 plus sites, there are so many systems in remote locations, and they need to be able to be protected at a moment's notice. And so, as we think a little bit further about this, I do want to briefly mention that advanced attacks that these adversarial state actors, target our country and our infrastructure with, tend to consider all possible secondary and tertiary effects when trying to do the most damage. And we are going to discuss what this means specifically with C-stores, but this is ultimately a military concept. So reading off the slide here, a bridge may be physically destroyed, and as a result of the bridge being destroyed, its lack of functionality degrades the transportation system. Now, the loss of the bridge may have a psychological impact. Maybe people no longer feel secure about driving over that bridge. And so the important aspect is to develop a better understanding of the inherent relationships and effects, for each level of effect, which is not just functional effects, but it's also psychological effects. It's also systemic effects. And so the question we're asking today is, are we prepared to go toe-to-toe against today's types of threats, whether it's another SolarWinds or whether it's like that water treatment facility, and are we prepared to avoid that digital catastrophe? And if not, what really has to change for us industry-wide to be as prepared as possible? And so as part of this discussion, we're going to first better understand what it means to view C-stores as critical infrastructure. And then we're going to dive deeper into the specific challenges that we face in the retail environment, namely that there are many players and many parties involved, and the bottlenecks in that communication and alignment are pretty obvious. And then from there, we'll consider, okay, how do we create that necessary alignment and that agility required to successfully face today's threat landscape, not just from a security response standpoint, but also from a disaster recovery and business continuity standpoint. And so let's start with that understanding of C-stores as critical infrastructure. In the last year, C-stores were designated by Department of Homeland Security as an essential service and part of our critical infrastructure. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But one thing we should keep in mind is that PCI, as a result of that, should no longer be seen as the gold mine for the most advanced cyber attackers. And we'll talk about what exactly it is they're looking to target in our environment. Of course, we are all involved in digital transformation efforts, and so it is worth considering that the attack surface is increasing, and Gregory DeClue here will be talking about that as well. And lastly, when we talked about those second and third order effects, we should think about what that actually means in the C-store and convenience retail environment. So first, looking at the bulletin that Homeland Security put out last year, reading that highlighted area, they designated gas stations and truck stops and the distribution systems that support them as part of our critical infrastructure. And they have some additional bullets that apply any retailers that sell food, any beverage projects, firms supporting that beverage distribution, food manufacturers, and there's a link here if you want to read more about that. And so as we think about that attack surface expanding, what are the implications in our environment, Greg?
Thanks, Ash. So we should take note that the C-store environment has changed over the past 24 hours or 24 months. Given the amount of vendors that are not connected to the retail C-store, the threat landscape has changed. It's not just your interior point of sale systems that are now targeted. You have your fuel dispensers, your ATGs, your back office PCs, your Internet of Things all connected to the internet. So those all bring with it inherent vulnerabilities. And as COVID has shown, we have to adapt as organizations. Doing so, we're moving now to in-person. Instead of in-person shopping now, we're talking about online ordering, delivering. All of those bring with them inherent vulnerabilities that we must consider. So taking into account what Ash had mentioned about first, second, third order attacks, looking at it specifically in the C-store environment, a supply chain interruption, some interruption in fuel delivery. Malicious actors could get into your ATG system and mess with the inventories, make reporting of inventories incorrectly, which could then in turn limit the amount of fuel delivery, causing outages. Second order effects that come from that, obviously loss of sales for the retailer. Public perspective, stores that are running out of fuel are not going to be frequented. Could cause lines of traffic and other disorder at stores that do have fuel, causing other bottlenecks and issues. Trickling all the way down to, depending on the amount of locations affected, whether it's geographic, whether it's retailer specific, you can be looking at overall impacts to the economy and ultimately civil unrest.
Great, thanks, Greg. So, now that we have that context of C-stores as critical infrastructure, we're going to now dive into the specific challenges that we face with security response in this multi-vendor environment. At a high level, as I mentioned, vendor gaps, gaps in communication, gaps in operations, introduce a set of bottlenecks that do have direct security implications. Along with that, a lack of alignment in that ongoing systems management can create certain specific security risks in terms of vulnerabilities that may not be detected, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, from a security response aspect, vendors currently in our industry are not typically aligned well enough to conduct an effective security response that involves multiple systems with multiple parties and different parties that might be managing them. And then lastly, from a business continuity standpoint, this is also, we feel, being carried out in silos and is not yet the collaborative activity it needs to be for it to be effective. And so, the multi-vendor environment, it does present, I guess you would call a catch-22, that has to be addressed. And so, obviously, there is an operational necessity for a multi-vendor environment. We have different levels of control on different systems. We have completely different replacement rates on systems. Some systems are in the stores for 5-10 years. Others are being replaced on an annual basis. There's a need, especially for the smaller operators, for there to be many different managed service providers, because as we all know, that can help reduce overhead and simplify operations. And then lastly, innovation can't be done alone, and that definitely cannot be done in a silo. And so it takes many different vendors addressing specific aspects of the tech stack in the environment. And all of these are pluses. The issue, as you look kind of to the right box there, is that there are those unique security challenges that we face. We have disparately managed systems where the security considerations on each system are not necessarily being thought of holistically. And beyond that, there are sometimes misaligned incentives that reduces responsibility. Certainly no vendor is looking to take on, or no third-party service provider or even the retailer, the merchant, the card companies, or anyone else. No one's looking to take on as much responsibility as they can. And so sometimes when we consider what that means from a security response standpoint or from a service provider standpoint, that can introduce gaps as everyone tries to reduce their scope. Beyond that, a set of bottlenecks around the lack of data sharing and the lack of integration and some other aspects we'll be discussing leads to a lack of coordination and security response. And so it's hard to really get all the necessary people together to address security issues as they arise. And lastly, as I mentioned, business continuity and disaster recovery do not necessarily take into account the full tech stack as it should. And so it's really business continuity more from a policy standpoint, but not from a practice standpoint.
So with this lack of alignment in the systems and the security challenges we're facing, as Ash mentioned, when you're talking about data siloing, you're looking at pulling updates, pulling patches, and things from various different locations, which is extremely resource intensive. There's an expense associated with doing these types of things, and you have to understand that expense, as well as your performance. Anytime you're going to do any type of patching, upgrading, of course, you want to take into consideration taking the system down, any outages, any collateral damage. Upgrading one system causes another system to fail. So by not doing these types of upgrades and doing these types of maintenances, you're assuming an unnecessary risk. So it's very important to get a balance between handling your management maintenance and minimizing that impact to the customer.
Thanks, Greg. So, as we talked about from a business continuity standpoint, third parties are not sufficiently aligned to coordinate, following security response going into the business continuity and disaster recovery.
Yeah, so now that we've discussed some of the security challenges with lack of the alignment, let's look at some of the third parties issues that they bring by not being aligned. You've got minimal sharing of security between vendors. You're going to have misalignment of incentives, no help desk alignment, disagreement on scope. All of those issues that when you come into disaster recovery and business continuity are not going to help the situation. You need to have these things worked out ahead of time and make sure your vendors are on the same page as you are when it comes to these responses.
Great. So to summarize at a high level, and these are pretty simple points, but they do have some tremendous consequences when we think about the security of our environment. As Greg mentioned, systems management is currently being done in silos. Updates, configurations, things of that nature aren't being done in a coordinated manner. When we think about the communication flows necessary for multi-vendor security response, different vendors do not necessarily have the contact information for other vendors. There's a lack of common data standards. There's not help desk integration. We talked about those misaligned incentives. And lastly, we talked about business continuity as being an afterthought. It's not being coordinated among all the different third-party vendors together around the retail environment. And that does have some pretty severe consequences that we will be discussing. So now that we have a sense of the high-level challenges we're facing dealing in this multi-vendor environment, we're going to now start diving into some of the strategies for overcoming this. First is, okay, how do we create alignment between all the different third-party vendors? So, you have these two rhinos facing off, being territorial about what they feel they are or not responsible for. And so let's, keep that as a context. Some of the things that we'll be talking about in terms of creating that alignment is first, what that evaluation process needs to look like to ensure that service providers are all abiding by the same standards. Then we'll get into ensuring that remote access and different entry points into the environment are being securely maintained and monitored. We'll talk a little bit about how to take disparate parties and create a cohesive unit, which is what really needs to happen. So that way, when fit hits the shin, as Greg would say, everyone is able to execute. We'll then look into specific technical requirements for integrating data and integrating systems, so that way everyone is seeing the same picture when the boots hit the ground and problems need to be solved. And then lastly, we're going to look actually at other models to understand how can we start communicating in a more community-driven manner rather than communicating in our silos or through various bottlenecks.
Thanks, Ash. So tip number one is selecting and evaluating your third-party service provider. And we're very fortunate that the PCI gives us a very good example of how to do that, gives us some recommendations on how to do that. So when it comes to selecting those vendors, making sure they're not only just checking the boxes to be compliant, but are actually doing these things that are important when you select them. Are they doing their background checks and those types of things? They're going to make them an actual vendor you want to have that relationship with. Tip number two, it would be moving towards that zero trust model. We've had other webinars in the past touch on this briefly, but getting that network segmentation, dividing things up, whether that's virtually, whether that's physically, taking that least privilege access policy, minimizing those users that have access to data they don't need access to, implementing that user management feature, your multi-factor authentications, logging of password changes, and just a general good password management program. Security training for all employees, specifically your frontline employees, those that we may not typically think fall under cybersecurity. You need to make sure everyone's aware of it, make sure everyone understands your program, and then ultimately making sure that your firewall rules that you're setting up and allowing access through are being done for more than just business justification and compliance. Try to minimize those types of things that you want to get around with.
Great, thanks, Greg. So now that we had that background on how to evaluate vendors and then on how to ensure that they are accessing the environment securely, we do have to think about what it looks like to get everyone on the same page. And this is really where the retailer has a big part to play. It must be an expectation that all third parties and the retailer take part in a collaborative process. And there are some basic steps that make a huge difference. The first is creating a shared contact list that is communicated to everyone. So if there's a security issue on the point of sale system, who's the security contact if you're a security vendor? Who's the key networking contact? Who's the key back office system contact? The payment processor contact? The contact in the dispenser segment. So that way, when problems arise, people are not going through unnecessary call trees and support channels. It can be directly addressed by the person responsible. And this information really needs to be shared throughout the life cycle of the program, not just to handle security response, but also to handle key IT activities, whether it's updates that might have impacts on other systems or whether that's new devices being deployed. Having that sort of transparency and fluidity between third parties, between vendors and the retailer is absolutely critical, but that can only happen once there's an initial program management structure in place. And that's both around security program management, understanding, what are the updates that need to happen, where are all the different patch cycles, where are the vulnerabilities, where are the exceptions being made, and ensuring that every vendor in the environment really understands this and understands it also from a compliance standpoint as well. And then finally, looking at it from a business continuity and disaster recovery aspect, the retailer's BCDR program, while it may be sufficient to complete, paperwork or complete just sort of the checkbook activity or checkbox activity for compliance, a real active, actionable BCDR program does have to actually involve coordinated activities among all the different third parties. And then finally, centralizing that secure data, integrating the help desk, integrating logs, integrating the site asset data. And so let's get into actually what that looks like. So when we think about integrating help desks, whether teams are using Jira or they're using Autotask or they're using ServiceNow or any number of these different platforms, there are some general questions that allow the remediation and issue management process to be smooth. So the first is, okay, considering what email can alerts or tickets add as a CC, which will then show up on other help desks. So if one company is working on a security issue that involves the networking vendor, being able to, on a same ticket thread, CC the appropriate help desk email, so that way as that issue goes from open to close, it's being monitored from multiple help desk platforms and multiple support teams are able to stay aligned. Plenty of these platforms have APIs, and the big thing in working with those APIs is simply making sure that common fields that are in place in order for the data to interchange properly. And so asking the question, which fields map to which systems? Now, when we say, implementing these APIs and thinking about these IT service management platforms, um, that could involve several parties that may not normally be considered. So it's the retailer, could be the networking vendor, the security vendor, but it could also be the service contractor who's actually the one involved in in-store break fix, things of this nature. It goes a long way when everyone is able to see the same issues with a common help desk and the common data flows. Going beyond that, there's so many different tools out there today that allow for collaboration, and it's absolutely necessary to leverage what they offer, whether you're using Microsoft Teams or Slack or Skype, creating common chat channels and common chat threads that allow people outside of a certain organization to get onto the same discussion and problem solve as needed. And then lastly, a big issue we do face, as I'm sure many of you on this call deal with, is a lack of transparency around the overall site assets that are in the environment. So what are the primary devices in the environment? What are the serial numbers for the different systems? What operating systems or versions are currently installed? Um, does every vendor have a network diagram? One thing Greg and I are really talking about today is not just taking actions and taking steps, but really changing our mindset in terms of behavior towards that transparency. Because the more transparency among the vendors in the environment, the easier it is to problem solve and manage things in a secure fashion. Touching a little bit more around that data sharing, it's critical to put that log information into a common format so that way all systems can read and ingest this information. Now, this falls under PCI requirement 10, but when we think about those common fields, we're thinking about the source system, the priority of the log, the type of log, the message, the time, making sure that it can be exported in a common format like CSV. And what this allows for is different vendors to share critical data that another vendor might need to close a security gap. Perhaps there is someone accessing a system that seems suspicious. Maybe they're suspecting a brute force attempt and they want to see those access control logs from another system. Being able to quickly interchange that data is what allows security to actually be practical when multiple parties are involved. Now, Greg and I mentioned earlier, looking at other models, which are also ultimately security focused, and then applying them into these situations that we deal with on a daily basis. So on the left side of the screen, now I don't use this, but Greg uses this and others use this, is the app Waze. And so it's app for, being able to navigate like Google Maps and anything else. But one thing that does make it unique is how much it is able to succeed just based on crowdsourced information around traffic jams, or if there's a police officer, waiting in a speed trap, or if there's an accident ahead. That community sourced data is what allows folks using this application or this platform to be even more secure. And looking at the right side of the screen, the Nextdoor app. This is straight from the Nextdoor in St. Louis. There's someone named Andrea talking about a license plate, that was when she was cleaning the backup camera. There was no front license plate after she cleaned it all off, and the holder was gone. And then she reported it to the police. And from there, there's a great chat thread. Someone is saying their stickers were stolen, and so on and so forth. There is discussions around other theft that might be in the neighborhood. This is another example of community watch. And so whether we look at Waze or whether we look at Nextdoor, the big takeaway here is this constant drive to communicate what we're seeing in a given environment. Hey, this might be some suspicious behavior, or are you guys aware of this vulnerability? Is there an exception for this? Did you guys, access the system at a certain time? Does this log look unusual to you? Our SIM platform flagged it. These are the types of conversations that need to be being had among multiple parties on a single thread constantly. Now it goes beyond that. It could be, hey, did you guys hear about, a firewall vendor like SonicWall or Palo Alto being breached? I believe, in this environment, that firewall is deployed. Is that correct? There are so many breaches and so many things happening that it's hard for anybody to keep on top of everything. And the only way we're able to stay on top of it is not by looking at monthly newsletters or something on the news. It's really about communicating what's on the ground constantly, so that way we can bring that community-driven approach to the C-store retail environment.
So another feed that is very important to take into account when you're looking at cybersecurity are these threat intelligence feeds. And what we've listed here are just a few feeds. There's many out there. One of the big questions is what is the purpose of these? Well, these are basically a play-by-play of what is being seen done by malicious threat actors, what their targets are believed to be, and what they plan to do with them. So by having this type of data available to you, you can then work with your vendors to try to be proactive, make changes, get those updates done, patches done, et cetera, to try to keep these types of malicious actors being able to execute on what they're looking to do. A lot of data out there, a lot of things to deal with. One easy way to digest the type of thing is make it part of your security program. Get it pulled into a system somewhere that's accessible, everything from your enterprise management solution all the way down to your techs in the field. But make sure that someone is digesting, taking these information seriously and looking at it, because it can make a big difference in planning your security.
Thanks, Greg. And similar to what Greg was saying in terms of sharing some of that threat data, some of you might be surprised to see Twitter, but Twitter feeds are a great way to track major security events as they're happening. Pay attention. Well, first things first, follow the security journalists and the researchers and select vendors on a Twitter feed. Perhaps set up a Twitter feed for your team or for your company, and then pay attention to retweets and comments and likes. If something is gaining traction, that is often worth keeping an eye on. And sometimes it's simply nice to have that Twitter feed going in the background, keep one eye on it. And if something seems to be blowing up, then it might be something worth discussing with your team, on that day, so that way you can stay on top of things. And like Twitter, and like we mentioned earlier, having your chat set up and having RSS feeds set up to not just facilitate group chats, but also aggregate different things like security blog posts or articles or things of this nature. So that way, relevant data is being fed to your organization, and you're able to curate content that is useful and applicable from a security standpoint. There is so much information out there. There's so much marketing content. And sometimes having these set up, these automated workflows set up ahead of time is really what makes a big difference in being actionable versus being overwhelmed. Great. And so just to summarize what we talked about from an alignment standpoint at a high level, it's really three areas. First, having that alignment between vendors from a management standpoint. So the evaluation of the vendors to setting up that program management and getting buy-in from all parties involved and ensuring that there's absolute clarity around defined responsibilities from a security scope standpoint. Now, once that is in place, we talked about various ways of having the necessary communication that allows everyone to work together successfully to keep an environment secure. The threat intel feeds that Greg talked about, having those chats set up, being able to push the latest content and security articles. And then lastly, the technical integration standpoint, leveraging available APIs and leveraging kind of email ingestion and using common data common data standards to ensure that everyone is able to see the necessary data at the necessary time. Once an incident response scenario is live, it's too late to be doing data engineering. And so setting this up ahead of time is what allows teams to be successful. And so going into the next section, okay, we have the groundwork to have that alignment, to have the necessary data available. Now, what does this look like as we actually, carry out that security response? One lesson from SolarWinds and one lesson from FireEye and others is that we have to be in a constant response mindset. Every day, every week, every month, every quarter, we have to be ready to constantly respond, like this kid here is taking pitches. that includes a few different facets to make that viable, such as having the necessary infrastructure in place to be able to scalably deploy detection and response tools and scripts and so on endpoints and networks as security issues arise. Having a lab, which Greg is going to go into some detail, that allows you to test systems and test different processes, test updates without bringing down your operations. Third, having an incident response plan that is able to continually evolve, and with the business continuity and disaster recovery plan, having one that actually encompasses the different vendors and is actionable rather than just a checkbox exercise. So we're going to first start with what we should not do.
Thanks, Ash. One of the biggest things you can't do is you can't be the ostrich in the situation where you just put your head in the sand and pretend you don't see the problem. If there's something that is affecting someone in the industry, chances are it could affect you as well. So you've got to take into account all of these different items we brought up, these different feeds. Use your resources, talk to your vendors, make sure you're understanding where things could happen. Try to get past those data silos and get things to a standardized platform. That's the only way you're going to be able to stay vigilant. You got to stay informed. That's the only way you can stay resilient.
Thanks, Greg. There have been plenty of great presentations in Conexxus about how to exactly implement the necessary security to both prevent against threats and respond quickly. And so I would urge you guys to take a look at those because it goes into much greater detail. But there are a few things we do want to touch on here. It is necessary to have those detection and response platforms and those SIM tools, those security information and event management tools that are able to aggregate the necessary data from the environment and detect on possible compromises. But also, going back to SolarWinds, there needs to be the ability to run automations on the endpoint. After the SolarWinds breach and after the FireEye breach, there were a variety of scanners and monitors that were released by different vendors that could detect the presence of those FireEye tools on the endpoint. The initial libraries for that were released by FireEye, but it's on the different vendors and the retailer to be able to actually deploy these tools immediately before there's an opportunity for a hacker to compromise the environment. And so there needs to be the necessary infrastructure in place to automate that activity. And then lastly, overall approaches to central management, whether that's implementing emergency firmware upgrades that firewall vendors are releasing more and more aggressively, even if it ends up bricking the hardware, being able to implement firewall changes as vulnerabilities come about. And so having that initial infrastructure in place to be able to respond effectively is absolutely crucial. And once again, I urge you to check out some of the other content that goes into this, that goes more deeply into this. Now, being able to have that infrastructure in place to deploy some of those tools and be scalable in a response scenario is important, but you do have to have a lab to provide that initial fail-safe and make this all viable.
Yeah, definitely, Ash. Anytime you're going to be making any type of security change in any equipment, there's always that unforeseen that could happen. So by having a lab that is as real world as possible, gives you that opportunity to make that change in your lab environment, get vendors involved in the testing, and have a lab you can break. That's the only way you're going to learn, and the only way you're going to be getting results is if you have the ability to actually tax that environment to the extreme and then to the breaking point, and then understand what's going on, bring it back up, be able to, again, continue to make those changes. And those single softwares that may not have the ability to have their own lab environment, look to your vendors, look to your authorized service contractors for that same support. They should hopefully be able to help you get that same data result without having to have the lab yourself.
Absolutely. And then, so when we think about incident response and getting everyone on the same page, we were fortunate to speak to one of our partners, Parameter Security, who deals directly with incident response as to what are the best practices when dealing in this multi-vendor environment. And one thing that came up is that laziness ends up being the primary factor behind a poor incident response strategy. And so the question is how to kind of get over that. And so the first things first, as we mentioned earlier, have an updated vendor contact list At the very minimum, incident response plans should be updated annually. Biannually or more often is preferable. But there are specific things that can be put in place contractually that allows an incident response plan to be actionable, such as having SLAs with vendors that say, every time a certain person on a certain team with one of the third-party service providers is replaced or leaves, you must update the retailer within 24 hours of who that new contact is. So that way, if an IR process is put into play, the right people are at the table to respond. Going from there, actually testing that incident response plan with the vendors is not something we see very happening very often. And so there's different ways to do that. One is, basically seeing if people are asleep at the wheel. So calling and emailing and seeing what the response rate is, around an incident response, a potential incident response event, and being proactive to make sure that everyone is ready to rock if that call is made and that event does happen. Something we haven't mentioned too much in this presentation, but I hope that is clear, is that we have to be prepared not just to prevent against threats, but ultimately to respond to threats. We can have the best measures in place. We can be as agile as possible. We can be as aligned as possible. But ultimately, all we can do is bring the probability of a possible compromise as low as we possibly can, but it will never be zero. And so having an incident response plan that is actionable is absolutely critical. And so then if we look at the actual disaster recovery and business continuity piece, it's absolutely crucial to work through scenarios. If pump software goes down, what do? How do you make sure that that software is functional again? What if there's an issue with the payment processor? Greg's going to be going more deeply into this in a moment, but the big takeaway here is that whether you're introducing new systems or whether you're replacing systems, a disaster recovery and business continuity plan must be a living process that is constantly being tested out. And it's important to just keep kicking the tires and actively breaking things to make your overall operation anti-fragile.
Thanks, Ash. And to your point, this business continuity plans and incident response plans, do no good just sitting on the shelf, and they do no good when you don't have your vendors involved. Real world scenario, you have a location or group of locations you believe have a breach has taken place. Having that vendor being able to provide you a clean iOS image that's going to be able to be pulled down and implemented in your stores, so you're not constantly worrying, is there still infections out there? Getting your security teams to deploy hardware and software for tracking, for monitoring, for searching for those potential vulnerabilities that may or may not still be known on your network. Monitoring your firewalls, looking for rogue traffic, all of those pieces that go into that disaster response and recovery plan to get yourself back up and back operational and not continuing to have that breach or that malicious threat actor setting on your network.
Absolutely. And so taking a step back and really, summarizing our core message here, when it comes to today's threat landscape and the threat landscape that we're going to see in the future, there's not going to necessarily be a specific party that can drop the hammer on everyone. It's not like PCI where you have certain, the card companies or your payment processor, your acquiring bank to be able to sort of force action. It's really incumbent upon us and everyone involved in the environment, whether it's the vendors and retailers and service contractors and everyone, to work together to be proactive rather than being reactive when a vulnerability comes up or when we hear about a specific threat. And so there are some scenarios we ultimately are all hoping to avoid. One is, if an issue arises, being completely ineffective during our security response scenario because no one has access to the data they need, the proper processes were not put in place, and no one has the right, the contacts to be able to coordinate and communicate in the necessary way. Another scenario we want to be able to avoid is that vulnerabilities are not being unnecessarily introduced into environments because there's no alignment that Greg talked about in managing systems and managing responsibilities and managing operations. And we also want to make sure we avoid that scenario where there was no business continuity plan in place, and whether it's a site controller or EPC or anything else that goes down at the site, that when that disaster event takes place and those backup systems or those processes for restoring data that are there, that we want to make sure that they actually function when they need to function. And so we want to avoid the scenario where that is not the case. And there's really three basic aspects to making this all possible, to making sure that we can succeed as best as possible in this new threat landscape. And that's ensuring that the right program alignment is in place, coordinating that program management and making sure there's that open communication, and then making sure that the technical alignment is in place, that we have the right integrations, the right data sharing, the right data standards, and those lab environments all ready to go. And then lastly, that from a policy standpoint, not just a vendor selection, PCI standpoint, but also that incident response policy and the disaster recovery policy, that they are actionable and they actually account for the full tech stack and vendors. And if we do these things, then when the next time a SolarWinds breach happens, and it will most likely happen, or we see those types of hacks happening with the water treatment center and they are targeting our sector, that we're prepared. And so that's primarily what we were hoping to cover today, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ashwin and Greg. That was really great and a ton of information. If anybody does have any questions, please feel free to type them into the questions panel now. And if there are any questions or follow-up you would like to discuss with Ash and Greg, their emails are up on the screen. And if you are interested in seeing any of the webinars that Ash and Greg referenced in this webinar, or you would like to see what we have coming up in these next few weeks and few months, feel free to go to Conexxus365.org and look through our webinars and subscribe if you would like to. And you can email 365@conexxus.org if you have any questions regarding any of our webinars. Currently, I see no questions. Again, thank you, Ashwin and Greg, for this wonderful presentation. It will be uploaded to Conexxus365.org in approximately 1 to 2 days, and the slide deck is available for review at Conexxus.org, our website. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the presenters or Conexxus. Thank y'all so much for attending, and thank y'all for presenting.
Thanks, Allie, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.